He shuffled through the mahogany doors, wearing a faded beige jacket that had seen better decades, his weathered hands clutching a small wrapped gift. The crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors where men in tailored suits discussed million-dollar deals over champagne. Harold's worn leather shoes squeaked against the polished surface as he approached the hostess stand. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I'd like a table for one, please." The hostess, draped in designer black, looked him up and down with barely concealed disgust. Her smile vanished. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake. This is Le Bernardin Royal." Before Harold could explain, Marcus Whitmore appeared, the restaurant's manager, impeccably dressed in a midnight blue suit. His eyes narrowed at Harold's simple appearance, taking in the frayed cuffs and modest shoes. "What seems to be the problem here?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested Harold was the problem. "I'd just like to have dinner," Harold repeated, his voice steady but gentle. Marcus let out a sharp laugh that cut through the restaurant's refined atmosphere. Several patrons turned to watch, their conversations pausing. "Look around you, old man. Do you see anyone dressed like that?" He gestured dismissively at Harold's jacket. "This isn't a soup kitchen," the whispers began. Harold felt every eye in the room studying him, judging him. His cheeks flushed, but he remained calm. "I have money to pay," Harold said simply. "I'm sure you do," Marcus smirked. "But we have standards here. Our clientele expects a certain atmosphere." He moved closer, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "You're making our guests uncomfortable. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Harold nodded slowly, his dignity intact despite the burning embarrassment. As he turned toward the door, Marcus called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Security will escort you if necessary." The laughter that followed him out was sharp and cruel, but what none of them knew was that tomorrow everything would change. The simple man they'd just humiliated carried secrets that would shake the very foundations of their arrogant world. Harold Benjamin Mitchell had been awake since dawn, just as he had every morning for the past 3 years. The small apartment above Riverside Veterans Shelter held no luxury: a single bed, a wooden table, and photos of Eleanor, his late wife, watching over everything with her gentle smile. But this morning routine wasn't about him. It never was. By 6 a.m., Harold was downstairs in the shelter's kitchen, preparing breakfast for 37 forgotten heroes, men who'd served their country and returned to a world that barely remembered their names. Harold knew each of their stories, their nightmares, their small victories. "Morning, Harry," called out James, a Vietnam veteran whose hands still shook from memories buried too deep to heal. "Good morning, James. How did you sleep?" Harold asked, ladling warm oatmeal into a bowl and adding extra brown sugar, just the way James liked it. What the elegant people at Le Bernardin Royal didn't know, what nobody in this city knew, was that Harold Benjamin Mitchell was the founder and driving force behind the Mitchell Foundation for Forgotten Veterans, an organization that had transformed thousands of lives over the past 15 years. He'd built it from nothing after Eleanor's death, channeling his grief into purpose. The foundation didn't just provide shelter. It offered job training, therapy, medical care, and something even more precious: dignity. Harold had personally overseen the placement of over 800 veterans into stable housing, watched them rebuild their lives one small step at a time. There was Tommy Rodriguez, who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan and now ran a successful auto repair shop thanks to the Foundation's business program. Sarah Chen, a Navy medic who'd struggled with PTSD until Harold connected her with the right therapist. She was now studying to become a counselor herself. But Harold never took credit. Official documents listed him simply as anonymous benefactor. Press releases mentioned only a private donor who wishes to remain unnamed. The Foundation's board knew him as Ben Mitchell, a humble volunteer who somehow always knew exactly what resources were needed. "You're doing it again," said Margaret, the shelter's head nurse, watching Harold quietly slip a $100 bill into the donation jar when he thought no one was looking. Harold just smiled, the same gentle expression he'd worn while being humiliated the night before. "Doing what?" "Pretending you're not the reason this place exists." Harold busied himself wiping down already clean counters. "Everyone deserves a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. That's not pretending, that's just basic human decency. Margaret shook her head in wonder. In 5 years of working alongside him, she'd never once heard Harold raise his voice, demand recognition, or speak harshly about anyone. Not even the city officials who'd initially tried to shut down the shelter, calling it an eyesore that brought down property values. Around noon, Harold walked through downtown on his way to the grocery store, the same route that took him past Le Bernardin Royal. Through the windows, he could see Marcus directing staff, his gestures sharp and impatient. Harold felt no anger, only sadness for a man who'd forgotten that wealth without kindness was just elaborate poverty. The first sign came on Tuesday morning when Detective Lisa Park walked into the veterans' shelter looking for Harold. "Are you Ben Mitchell?" she asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already knew the answer was more complicated. Harold looked up from the chess game he was playing with Robert, an elderly Marine who visited the shelter for companionship. "I am. Is everything all right?" Detective Park studied his face carefully. "I'm investigating a series of anonymous donations to families of fallen officers. Large donations. The bank records trace back to accounts connected to this address, but..." She paused, clearly puzzled. "The signature on the transfers says H.B. Mitchell." Harold's gentle smile never wavered, but Robert noticed how his friend's hand tightened slightly around his chess piece. "Perhaps there's been some confusion with the paperwork," Harold said simply. Detective Park wasn't satisfied. Something about this modest old man didn't add up. She'd been investigating financial crimes for 12 years, and her instincts were screaming that Harold Mitchell was far more than he appeared to be. Meanwhile, across town at Le Bernardin Royal, Marcus Whitmore was having his own moment of doubt. The restaurant's new sommelier, Patricia Chen, Sarah's older sister, had been asking questions about the elderly gentleman who was asked to leave. "Why do you care about some random homeless guy?" Marcus had snapped. "Because," Patricia said carefully, "my sister works with veterans and she mentioned someone matching his description. Someone who's done remarkable things for people like my father." Marcus dismissed her concerns, but Patricia's words planted an uncomfortable seed. That evening, he found himself looking up local veterans organizations online, scrolling through articles about anonymous donors and mysterious benefactors. One article in particular caught his attention. "Local hero donates $2 million to veterans." Housing project. Identity remains unknown. The accompanying photo showed the groundbreaking ceremony for a new facility. In the background, barely visible, stood a familiar figure in a beige jacket. Marcus stared at the screen, his confidence wavering for the first time in years. At the shelter, Harold continued his routine, unaware that the walls of his carefully maintained anonymity were beginning to crack. He helped Mrs. Johnson with her medication, listened to Tommy's dreams of expanding his auto shop, and quietly arranged for dental care for 3 veterans who couldn't afford it. But late that night, as he sat by his window looking out at the city lights, Harold touched the small medallion he always kept in his jacket pocket, a decoration he'd never shown to anyone, not even Eleanor. The weight of secrets he'd learned was both a burden and a blessing. It protected his privacy, but sometimes made him feel invisible in ways that had nothing to do with humility. Tomorrow would be different, though he didn't know it yet. Tomorrow the careful balance between his two worlds would finally collapse, and the simple man who'd been laughed out of a fancy restaurant would be revealed for who he truly was. The truth has a way of surfacing when we least expect it, and for Harold Benjamin Mitchell, that moment was less than 24 hours away. On Wednesday afternoon, Harold was walking past Le Bernardin Royal again when the impossible happened. A black sedan with government plates pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a figure that made Harold's breath catch, Captain Edward Morrison of the Queen's Guard, resplendent in his crimson uniform with gold braiding. Harold recognized him immediately, though they hadn't seen each other in over 15 years. Captain Morrison's eyes scanned the sidewalk and locked onto Harold's face. Recognition dawned instantly, followed by something that stunned every passerby. The captain snapped to rigid attention and executed a perfect military salute. "Sir Harold Benjamin Mitchell," Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying across the busy street. "It is my profound honor." The effect was immediate and electric. Pedestrians stopped. Car windows rolled down. Marcus Whitmore, who'd been arguing, with a supplier near the restaurant's entrance, felt his heart skip a beat. Harold stood perfectly still, his gentle composure never breaking, but something shifted in his bearing. Without changing his humble appearance, he somehow commanded the space around him. "Captain Morrison," Harold said quietly, extending his hand. "It's good to see you again. Sir, I must apologize for the informality, but when I saw you..." Morrison's voice carried genuine emotion. "Sir, what you did for my unit in Helmand Province, we never forgot. Never." A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the spectacle of a Queen's Guard paying respect to an elderly man in a simple beige jacket. Cell phones appeared, recording everything. Marcus found himself moving closer, his earlier confidence crumbling with each word. Captain Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the growing crowd, "you are in the presence of a true hero." Sir Harold Benjamin Mitchell was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross with Bar, and was personally knighted by Her Majesty for extraordinary valor under fire. The crowd murmured in amazement. Harold remained modest, uncomfortable, with the attention. "Captain, please..." "No, sir, with respect, this needs to be said." Morrison turned back to the crowd. "This man single-handedly rescued 43 wounded soldiers from an ambush in Afghanistan. Under heavy fire, for over 6 hours, he made trip after trip into the kill zone. He saved my life and the lives of dozens of others." Marcus felt sick. The homeless man he'd humiliated was a knight of the realm, but Morrison wasn't finished. And after his military service, Sir Harold established the Mitchell Foundation, which has housed and rehabilitated thousands of veterans. He's donated over £20 million of his personal fortune to help forgotten heroes rebuild their lives. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Is this the same Mitchell Foundation that saved the shelter downtown?" "The very same," Morrison confirmed. "Sir Harold has been working there personally, every day for years, asking for no recognition, taking no credit. Before you subscribe to hear how this incredible story unfolds, let me tell you about the moment that changed everything." Harold looked directly at Marcus through the restaurant window, and what happened next would redefine everything Marcus thought he knew about dignity, respect, and the true meaning of nobility. The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd, but Harold's response was what truly left everyone speechless. As Marcus Whitmore stood frozen behind the restaurant's glass doors, watching his entire worldview collapse, Harold did something that no one expected. He thanked Captain Morrison, quietly, then walked straight toward the restaurant. Marcus's legs felt like water as Harold approached. The same man he'd publicly humiliated now stood before him, not as a vengeful figure seeking retribution, but with the same gentle dignity he'd shown 3 nights ago. "Mr. Whitmore," Harold said simply, his voice carrying no anger, no triumph, just quiet strength. Marcus stammered, his face flushed with shame. "Sir Harold, I had no idea. I never meant to..." "I know," Harold interrupted gently. "You saw an old man in worn clothes and made assumptions. It happens more often than you might think." The crowd pressed closer to the windows, straining to hear. Patricia Chen, the sommelier, stood among the staff with tears in her eyes. Finally, understanding why her sister had spoken of Harold with such reverence. "I should have looked deeper," Marcus whispered, his arrogance completely shattered. "I should have seen..." "What should you have seen?" Harold asked, not unkindly. "A knight? A war hero? Would that have made me more deserving of basic human dignity?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everyone listening. Marcus had no answer. Around them, the elegant patrons who had laughed at Harold's humiliation now watched in stunned silence, many recognizing their own capacity for the same shallow judgments. "The measure of a person," Harold continued, "isn't found in their title or their bank account. It's found in how they treat others, especially those who can do nothing for them in return." Captain Morrison, still standing at attention nearby, spoke up. "Sir Harold once told me that true nobility isn't about being superior to other men. It's about being superior to your former self." Harold smiled at the memory. "Eleanor used to say that kindness costs nothing but means everything." She was right, as usual. The mention of his late wife brought a softness to Harold's eyes that made even Marcus's hardened heart ache. with recognition of genuine love and loss. "I came here tonight," Harold said, his voice growing stronger, "not for an apology or revenge. I came because I believe people can change, can grow, can become better than they were yesterday." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the small wrapped gift he'd carried 3 nights ago, the same one he'd intended to give to a server. As a thank you, a habit Eleanor had taught him years ago. "This was for whoever served me that night," Harold said, offering it to Marcus. "It's nothing expensive, just a small token of gratitude for their service." Marcus stared at the gift with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the grace being shown to him by a man he'd treated with such contempt. "Sir Harold," he whispered, "how can you forgive so easily?" "Because," Harold replied, "holding on to anger only hurts the person carrying it. And because everyone deserves a second chance to do better." What happened that day outside Le Bernardin Royal wasn't just about one man's humiliation or another's redemption. It was about something deeper, the quiet revolution that happens when we choose to see people as they truly are, rather than as we assume them to be. Harold Benjamin Mitchell never sought recognition for his service, his charity, or his daily acts of kindness. He understood something that our world often forgets. True greatness doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It shows up quietly, consistently, in small moments when no one is watching. The veterans at the shelter knew this. They'd seen Harold arrive before dawn to prepare breakfast, stay late to comfort nightmares, and slip money into donation jars when he thought no one was looking. They'd watched him treat every person, regardless of their past, their mistakes, or their appearance, with the same steady dignity. That's the lesson that echoed through the crowd that day, spreading far beyond the restaurant's marble floors. In our rush to judge others by their clothes, their accents, their apparent status, we risk missing the extraordinary people hidden in plain sight. The simple man you overlook in the grocery store might be the teacher who stays late every day to help struggling students. The elderly woman you dismiss at the bus stop might be the volunteer who's been feeding homeless families for 20 years. The quiet person in worn clothes might be the one whose anonymous donations keep community programs alive. Harold's story reminds us that nobility isn't about titles or wealth. It's about character. It's about choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. It's about serving others without expecting applause. It's about treating every person you meet as someone worthy of respect, because they are. As Harold walked away that day, his simple beige jacket unchanged, his gentle manner intact, he left behind something more valuable than any lecture or punishment. Could have been. He left an example of what it looks like to remain gracious under pressure, to forgive without conditions, and to live with quiet dignity regardless of how others choose to treat you. So the next time you encounter someone who doesn't fit your expectations, remember, Harold. Remember that appearances can deceive, that true worth isn't always visible, and that the most remarkable people are often hiding in the most ordinary places. The question isn't whether you'll meet someone extraordinary today. You probably already have. The question is whether you'll recognize them.